Pat Murphy was not supposed to say that. Not there. Not in front of those cameras. Not with the microphone still hot and the reporters still scribbling and the game barely 30 minutes in the past. A manager in his position, a man who has spent decades in professional baseball learning exactly when to speak and exactly when to let the silence do the work, was not supposed to walk into that press conference room and say what he said. But he did. And the moment the words left his mouth, something shifted in the room. Not dramatically. Not the way a table flips or a door slams. More like the way the air changes right before a storm. Subtle. Immediate. Impossible to ignore once you've felt it. Don't involve Shohei in the Cy Young Award race anymore. A reporter looked up from his notepad. Another stopped typing. Someone near the back of the room leaned forward slightly, the way people do when they're not sure they heard something correctly and don't want to ask for a repeat because asking might break the spell. Nobody broke it. Murphy sat there. His jaw set. His eyes not apologetic. Not retreating from what he had just said. If anything, he looked like a man who had been holding that sentence inside for weeks, maybe longer, and had finally, in front of every camera in the room, decided he was done holding it. This was not a sound bite. This was not a manager working the media to motivate his players or protect his roster or deflect a difficult question with a more interesting answer. This was something rarer and more uncomfortable than any of that. This was a man who had just watched Shohei Ohtani pitch. And what he saw had made him angry. Not at Ohtani. Not at the Dodgers. Not at any opponent or umpire or front office decision. At the conversation itself. At the idea, the comfortable, well-intentioned, completely wrong idea, that what Ohtani does on a pitching mound belongs in the same sentence as a trophy. To understand why Murphy said what he said, you have to understand what he watched. It wasn't a dominant start in the traditional sense. It wasn't the kind of performance where a pitcher mows through a lineup on pure velocity, where the radar gun tells the story and the batters walk back to the dugout shaking their heads at something they simply couldn't catch up to. What Ohtani did that night was different. More complicated. More unsettling, in a way that the final box score doesn't fully capture. He was operating at something below his ceiling. Anyone who has watched him pitch enough times could feel it, the way you can sense a musician playing through discomfort, the notes still right but the ease behind them slightly absent. His fastball was there. His sweeper was sharp enough. His command was precise in the way that only a pitcher of his intelligence can maintain even when his body is asking him quiet questions he isn't answering out loud. But it was the soul of it that caught Murphy. That was the word reporters kept coming back to afterward. Soul. It was an unusual word for a baseball press conference. Baseball press conferences deal in pitch counts and exit velocity and launch angles and whip. They deal in the measurable. The quantifiable. The kind of language that turns a human performance into a series of numbers that can be compared against other numbers across other nights in other stadiums going back 100 years. What Ohtani did that night didn't fit into that language cleanly. He threw with something that looked like awareness. Not just of the batters in front of him or the runners on base or the count on the board. Awareness of the moment itself. Of what was being asked of him. Of the gap between what his body was offering and what the game required. And he filled that gap with something that doesn't show up in any database. Murphy watched it from the opposing dugout. He watched it the way a manager watches a performance that makes him forget, briefly, that he is the opposition. That his job in that moment is to find ways to disrupt exactly what he is watching. He watched it. And when it was over, when his team had been held to nothing and the final out had been recorded and the stadium had released the breath it had been holding, he walked into the visiting manager's press conference room and sat down. And confessed. He didn't start with it. He answered the early questions the way managers do after a difficult loss. Measured. Professional. Acknowledging what his team didn't do well, crediting the opponent's execution, refusing to use the word frustrating even though it was written across every line of his face. But then a reporter, one of the younger ones, the kind who hasn't yet learned which questions are safe and which ones open doors that can't be closed, asked the one that mattered. When you watch Ohtani pitch like that, does it change the way you think about his place in the Cy Young conversation this year? Murphy looked at him. Not the look of a man who is calculating his answer. The look of a man who has already calculated it, who calculated it somewhere in the third inning and has been sitting with the answer ever since, waiting for someone to ask. He leaned slightly forward. His voice when it came was not loud. It didn't need to be. I'm going to say something and I want people to actually hear it. Don't involve Shohei in the Cy Young Award race anymore. The room registered it. The silence was immediate and complete. Not because he doesn't deserve it. Not because what he does out there isn't extraordinary. But because the Cy Young Award is a pitching award. And what Shohei Ohtani does is not pitching. It is something else entirely. And when we put it in that category, when we compare it to what other pitchers do across 200 innings on full rest with a single job, we shrink it. We make it smaller than it is. And that's an insult to him, even if we mean it as a compliment. Another silence. He pitched tonight through something. I don't know what. His medical situation is his business and the Dodgers' business. But I've been in this game long enough to know when a man is giving you everything he has and when a man is giving you everything he has left. Tonight was the second thing. And it was still better than almost anything I've seen this year. He stopped. Looked at the table for a moment. Then back up. That's not a Cy Young conversation. That's a different conversation entirely. And I don't think we have the right language for it yet. By the time Murphy's words reached the East Coast, the argument had already started. It started, as most arguments start now, in the rapid, fragmented way that opinions travel, a clip here, a quote there, a reaction to a reaction to a reaction until the original words are somewhere in the middle of a conversation that has grown much larger than the room where they were spoken. Some took Murphy's side immediately and completely. Former pitchers, mostly. Men who had spent careers accumulating innings in the way that the Cy Young voters understand, starts every 5 days, full seasons, the grinding, repetitive, beautifully exhausting work of being a number one starter across 6 months and 30-plus starts. They heard Murphy and nodded. They understood what he was saying. There is a cost to that work that doesn't appear in the ERA column. And when you compare someone doing that work to someone operating under different constraints, however extraordinary those constraints might be, the comparison is not clean. Others pushed back hard. The statisticians. The analysts. The people who believe that what matters is what happens between the lines and that the conditions around a performance are separate from the performance itself. If Ohtani's ERA is 0.73 when he pitches, they argued, then 0.73 is 0.73. The award goes to the best pitcher. If Ohtani is the best pitcher, the award goes to Ohtani. The conversation about how many starts he makes, about the two-way nature of his role, about what he carries into those starts, that is interesting, but it is separate. The television shows debated it through the afternoon. Radio programs carried it into the evening. Former managers were called. Former Cy Young winners were called. People who had voted for the award, people who had won the award, people who had lost the award by a single vote, all of them were asked the same thing. Is Pat Murphy right? And the answers were not clean. Because the question was not clean. Because Ohtani is not clean, not in the sense that the existing categories of baseball were built to contain him. Lost in the noise of the media debate was something smaller and more important. What Murphy actually saw that night. Not the statistics. Not the ERA. Not the innings pitched or the strikeout-to-walk ratio or any of the other numbers that the Cy Young voters will eventually arrange on a spreadsheet and use to make their decision. What he saw was a man pitching soulfully. That word again. The word that kept surfacing despite the sport's preference for more precise language. There was a moment, Murphy mentioned it in passing near the end of the press conference, almost as an afterthought, but it was the moment that stayed, in the fourth inning. A two-strike count. A hitter who had worked the at-bat intelligently, who had fouled off 3 pitches and was sitting on the fastball, the way you can sometimes read a pitcher's intention when he's working hard and his patterns become slightly more predictable. Ohtani shook off the sign. Once. Twice. And then he threw the pitch he wanted to throw. Not the one the data suggested. Not the one the defensive alignment was prepared for. The one that came from somewhere deeper and quieter than scouting reports, the decision of a man who has faced enough hitters in enough important moments to trust something that doesn't have a name in the analytics vocabulary. It was a ball. Outside. Just off the corner. The hitter didn't swing. The count went full. And then Ohtani threw the sweeper and the hitter was done. Murphy watched that sequence. All 7 pitches of it. And what he saw in the shake-off, in that small, stubborn, deeply personal act of refusing the recommended pitch in favor of the right pitch, was what made him angry later. Not angry at Ohtani. Angry at the idea of reducing what he had just witnessed to a number and placing that number in a column next to other numbers. The Cy Young Award is a great award, Murphy said, before he left the room. It belongs to great pitchers. Shohei Ohtani is something else. And we should be honest enough to say so. Dave Roberts heard what Murphy said. Of course he did. In the modern media environment, a manager hears everything within minutes, sometimes seconds, of it being said. His phone tells him. His coaches tell him. The reporters who were in Murphy's press conference show up in his, carrying the words with them like questions wrapped inside questions. Roberts didn't dismiss it. That was what was notable. He didn't laugh it off. He didn't perform the casual confidence of a manager whose star player has just been complimented in the most complicated way possible. He listened to the question. He set his hands flat on the table in front of him. And he answered carefully. I respect Pat Murphy enormously. He's been in this game a long time and he knows what he's talking about. But I'll say this, Shohei doesn't pitch to win awards. He pitches to win games. And right now, he's winning games. A reporter pushed back gently. But didn't Murphy have a point about the nature of the Cy Young, about the innings, the workload, the comparison to traditional starters? Roberts nodded slightly. Not in agreement. In acknowledgement. The difference matters. Every year there are pitchers who throw 200 innings and pitchers who throw 150 and the voters decide what matters most. That's always been true. The only thing that's new is that nobody's ever had to make that decision about someone like Shohei. He paused. And I think that's actually Pat's point. He's not wrong about that part. Ohtani was asked. Through his interpreter, after he had changed and the training staff had finished and the stadium had emptied to the particular quiet that only exists after a game where something important happened and everyone knows it, he was asked what he thought about Murphy's comments. He smiled. Slightly. The way he smiles at questions that he finds more interesting than annoying. Then he said something that was translated and passed to the reporters and written down and sent around the country within minutes. I just want to pitch well. What people call it after, that's not my job. Simple. Unhelpful to the debate. Perfectly Ohtani. Because the debate was never really about the award. Murphy knew it. Roberts knew it. The analysts arguing on television knew it somewhere underneath the argument. The debate was about language. About the limits of the existing vocabulary. About what happens when something arrives in the world that the current categories cannot hold, and everyone has to decide whether to force it into the closest available box or admit that a new box is needed. Pat Murphy, in a visiting manager's press conference room, in a tone that was angry and honest and more vulnerable than press conferences usually allow, chose the second option. He didn't have the new language either. Nobody does yet. But he was the first one, in that room, on that night, to say out loud that the old language wasn't enough. The Cy Young Award will be decided in the fall. The votes will be cast. A name will be announced. A trophy will be lifted. Whether that name is Ohtani's or not, whether the voters decide that the extraordinary nature of his workload disqualifies him or defines him, the award itself will continue to mean what it has always meant. But Pat Murphy's words will linger past the fall. Past the vote. Past whatever the scoreboard eventually says. Because he wasn't really talking about the Cy Young Award. He was talking about the problem of watching something that doesn't fit, and reaching for the closest available word anyway, and feeling, in the moment you say it, how wrong the fit is. He watched Ohtani pitch soulfully through something difficult, in a game that mattered, with a lineup in front of him that was doing everything right, and the best word the sport could offer him afterward was Cy Young candidate. And he sat in front of the microphones and said, quietly, with something very close to reverence dressed up as anger. That's not enough. He's more than that. Find better words.